I found the document on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Philip had left the study door open, which he never did. I was walking past with a cup of coffee when I saw it sitting on the edge of the desk, not hidden, not locked away. Just sitting there in a manila folder with the flap folded back, like he'd been looking at it and forgot to put it away. I set my coffee on the hall table, walked in, picked it up, quitclaim deed. My address at the top, my name listed as the grantor, and at the bottom, my signature, except I never signed it. I stood there for probably 2 minutes, just read it. Read it again. The property was being transferred to something called Summit Crest Holdings, LLC. I'd never heard of it. The notary stamp was dated 6 weeks earlier. I put it back exactly where I found it. Picked up my coffee, went to the kitchen and sat down. My name is Gerald Holt. I'm 67 years old. I live in Cleveland, Ohio, in a house I've owned outright for over 30 years. I spent 25 years working as a private investigator before I retired. I've sat across from liars, cheats, fraudsters, and people who genuinely believed they were smarter than everyone in the room. The one thing that job teaches you is this: don't react, not until you know everything, because the moment you react, they know what you know. And then you've lost your advantage. So I sat in my kitchen, drank my coffee, and didn't say a word. That was the beginning, but to understand how I got there, you need to go back a little further. Nadine passed away 3 years ago, ovarian cancer, 8 months from the first symptom to the end. She was 63, which is no age at all. We'd been married 38 years. She taught 3rd grade at an elementary school 2 miles from our house. She had a reading chair in the corner of the living room, green with wooden armrests, and she'd sit there every evening with a book and a cup of chamomile tea. I moved that chair into the spare room about a year after she died. I couldn't stop looking at it. Carolyn is our only child. She's 34 now. She married Philip Crane about 6 years ago. He was in commercial real estate, or said he was. There was always a deal coming together, always a reason the last one hadn't worked out. I didn't dislike him in the beginning. He was charming when he wanted to be. He made Carolyn laugh. After Nadine died, Carolyn started coming around more. Sundays mostly, she'd bring food, sit with me, ask how I was doing. I appreciated it. She's always been more like her mother than like me, which is a compliment. Nadine knew how to be present with people in a way I never quite figured out. About 14 months after the funeral, Carolyn sat across from me at the kitchen table and said she and Philip were thinking about moving in. Their apartment lease was ending. She was 4 months pregnant. She said I shouldn't be alone in this house. She wasn't wrong about that part. I said yes. The first few months were genuinely fine. Oliver was born in January. I'd get up early and bring him downstairs so Carolyn could sleep. I'd sit in the kitchen with him while it was still dark out, and he'd look up at me with that unfocused newborn stare, and it helped more than I expected. There were good evenings too. Carolyn would make her mother's pot roast on Sundays, and we'd eat at the table together. And sometimes I'd catch her looking around the kitchen, and I'd know she was thinking about Nadine too. We didn't have to say it, that was enough. But Philip had a way of testing the edges of whatever space he was in. It started with the bedroom. Their room was smaller, and with the baby they needed more space. I moved to the guest room. That was fine, I told myself. That's what you do. Then the car. Theirs needed repairs. Could they borrow mine for a few days? The few days became a few weeks. Eventually I stopped asking when they'd be done with it, and just started walking to the diner when I wanted to get out. Then the study. He needed a home office. I could use the kitchen table, couldn't I? Of course I could. Each thing by itself was nothing. You couldn't point to any one of it and call it what it was. That's how it works. The pieces are small. You almost feel unreasonable for noticing. But I noticed. I started watching the way I used to watch on a job, quietly, without changing anything about how I moved through the house. Mail was arriving addressed to companies I didn't recognize. Philip would shut his laptop the moment he heard me in the hallway. Carolyn showed up one afternoon with a necklace I knew cost more than she made in 2 weeks. She said it was a gift from Philip for their anniversary. I nodded and said it was nice. I kept watching. When I found that quitclaim deed in March, I already had 6 weeks of observations sitting in the back of my mind. I knew something was wrong before I even picked up that folder. Finding it just told me what shape the wrong was. Now I needed to know the full extent of it. So I started looking over the next 2 weeks. I went through the study carefully. I didn't do it all at once. That's the mistake people make. They find something and they tear the place apart looking for more. And then whoever they're looking at knows someone's been through their things. I took my time. A drawer here, a folder there, always when Philip was out and Carolyn was upstairs with Oliver. The reverse mortgage paperwork was in the back of the bottom desk drawer, folded inside a brown envelope with no label. $310,000 borrowed against my house. The lender was listed as Apex Lending Group. I knew that name. 12 years ago, I worked a fraud case that touched on a private lending network operating out of 3 states. Apex was one of the names that came up in the documentation. They weren't a traditional lender. They operated in the spaces where regular banks wouldn't go, and they collected in ways that didn't involve courtesy calls or payment plans. Philip had borrowed $310,000 from people like that, using a forged version of my signature with my house as the collateral. I photographed every document with my phone, put everything back, went downstairs and started dinner. That evening I watched them at the table. Philip talking about a development project in Akron, some deal he was putting together with a couple of investors. Carolyn feeding Oliver in the high chair, nodding along. They looked like a normal family having a normal dinner. I ate my food and listened and didn't say anything. There's something clarifying about knowing. When you're only suspicious, there's still a part of your brain arguing with itself, telling you maybe you're wrong, maybe there's an explanation. Once you know, that noise stops. Everything gets very quiet and very clear. I gave it 3 more weeks before I said anything. I needed one more piece. The thing about forged documents is that a single signature is hard to prove in isolation. Handwriting experts can be challenged. Documents can be argued over. Timelines get muddled. What makes a case solid is pattern, consistency of behavior. Multiple instances. A chain that connects to an obvious motive. I called Leonard Briggs on a Thursday evening from my car, parked 2 blocks from the house. Leonard and I worked together for 11 years before he shifted into legal consulting. He's the kind of man who doesn't make you explain yourself twice. I told him what I had. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Don't confront them yet. Send me the photos. Let me make some calls." I sent him the photos that night. He called back 2 days later with confirmation that Summit Crest Holdings LLC had been registered in Delaware 4 months earlier. The registered agent was a shell address. The sole member listed was a holding company that traced back through 2 more layers to a personal account connected to Philip Crane. He'd built the whole structure before they even moved in. That hit me harder than I expected, because it meant the conversation at my kitchen table, Carolyn telling me they wanted to be closer, that they were worried about me being alone. That was not a spontaneous decision. They'd planned it, or at least Philip had planned it, which raised its own set of questions about Carolyn. I sat with that for a while. I've known Carolyn her whole life. I know how she laughs. I know how she sounds when she's actually upset versus when she's performing upset. I know she has her mother's stubbornness and her mother's loyalty, both of which are real and run deep. What I didn't know and still don't know with complete certainty is exactly how much she knew. She'd grown up watching me work. She knew I was methodical. She knew I didn't miss things. If she was involved from the beginning, she would have known there was a real chance I'd figure it out. Either she trusted Philip's assurances that they'd covered their tracks, or she told herself some version of a story where this was temporary, where they'd pay it back, where it wasn't really what it was. People are very good at telling themselves that kind of story. I've seen it dozens of times in this work. It doesn't make them innocent, but it makes them different from someone who looks you in the eye and decides to take from you with no story at all. Philip, I was fairly sure, was the second kind. The Sunday it came apart started like any other. I went to visit Nadine in the morning, same as every week. I sat with her for a while and told her what was happening. Told her I was sorry for the situation, sorry our daughter was in the middle of it, sorry I hadn't seen it sooner. The wind moved through the trees and I chose to take that as a response. I came home and made pot roast, Nadine's recipe, the one Carolyn had been making on Sundays since she was old enough to cook. I set the table, poured water, waited for them to come down. Dinner was quiet at first. Philip was on his phone. Carolyn was cutting Oliver's food into small pieces, normal enough. Then Philip mentioned the property tax on the house, specific numbers. Said them the way you say something when you've been looking at it regularly. When it's become yours in your head already. I set down my fork. I looked at him and said I knew about Summit Crest Holdings. The color left his face so fast it was almost interesting to watch. Carolyn stopped cutting Oliver's food. She put the knife down on the edge of the plate and looked at me. I kept my voice level, told him I knew about the quitclaim deed, told him I knew about the reverse mortgage in the $31 and Apex Lending Group, told him I knew the signature on those documents wasn't mine. Philip pushed his chair back, started talking fast, said I didn't understand the full picture, that it was a temporary arrangement, that he was going to explain everything when the time was right. His voice went up in pitch the longer I sat there without reacting. That's what happens when someone expects you to get emotional and you don't. They start filling the silence themselves and they say too much. I looked at Carolyn while he talked. She was looking at the table. Philip stood up. Said I was making something out of nothing. Said he had handled it. Said some things that weren't worth repeating. Then he stepped toward me, and I'll say this for him. I don't think he planned what happened next. I think he was cornered and scared, and he reacted the way small men react when they realize they've been caught. He shoved me, both hands hard against my chest. I was standing near the base of the staircase. I went down and caught myself wrong on my right wrist. Something cracked. I sat on the floor and felt the pain move up my arm in a long, slow wave. I looked up at Carolyn. She was standing in the kitchen doorway. Oliver had started crying from his high chair. She looked at me on the floor, and I watched her face, and I saw the moment where she made her choice. She turned back toward the kitchen. Philip grabbed his keys off the counter, said they were going out for a while. Carolyn picked up Oliver without looking at me again. The front door closed. The house went quiet. I sat there for a minute, took stock. The wrist was bad. My hip hurt where I'd landed but seemed okay. I wasn't dizzy. I called a cab from my phone. Rode to the ER. Told the intake nurse I'd had a fall at home. She was thorough, asked the right questions, and I answered them carefully without giving her anything she couldn't use. They x-rayed the wrist, fractured distal radius. They put me in a cast, gave me something for the pain, and told me to follow up with an orthopedic specialist. Before I left the waiting room, I took out my phone and documented the bruising on my palm and forearm. Then I filed an incident report with the hospital's patient advocate, noting the circumstances of the injury, not an accusation, just a record, dated, time-stamped, attached to my file. Then I called Leonard. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what happened. He didn't waste time on sympathy, which is one of the things I've always appreciated about him. He said, "Good. The ER record plus the incident report gives us physical evidence with a date. Don't go back to that house tonight. Is there somewhere you can stay?" I told him I was going back to my own house. He paused. Then he said, "Fine," but to call him immediately if Philip came back before morning. Philip and Carolyn didn't come home until after 11. I heard them come in. Heard them go upstairs. Nobody knocked on my door. I lay in the dark in the guest room with my wrist elevated and thought about what came next. Here's what I knew about my situation. I had photographs of forged documents. I had a paper trail connecting Philip to Summit Crest Holdings. I had Leonard's research on the LLC structure. I had an ER record from that evening. What I didn't yet have was Philip's own hand confirming the connection between himself and the fraudulent transaction in a way that couldn't be argued away. I needed one more thing. Leonard came up with the idea of the supplemental document. It was clean and it was simple. We had the attorney draft what looked like a routine property disclosure form, the kind that gets generated during title reviews. The attorney noted a minor clerical discrepancy in the original transaction and said it required a corrective signature from all parties involved in the transfer. We made sure the form referenced the Summit Crest Holdings transaction specifically. I left it on the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning with a sticky note that said the title company needed it back by Friday. I told Philip it was something the attorney had flagged. Routine stuff, nothing to worry about. He looked at it for about 30 seconds. Asked if he needed to do anything. I said if he was involved in the property management, they'd probably want his signature too, just to keep the paperwork clean. He signed it. I took the form, drove to Leonard's office, and handed it across the desk. Leonard looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked up at me. "That's it," he said. "That's the chain." We filed everything the following Wednesday morning. Leonard delivered the package in person to the county prosecutor's office and Adult Protective Services. The package included the photographed originals, the LLC research, the ER documentation, the incident report, and the signed supplemental form with Philip's signature connecting him directly to the fraudulent transfer. By Thursday afternoon, I got a call from Leonard saying Philip had been taken into custody. I was sitting in my kitchen when he told me. I looked out the window at the backyard for a moment. Then I said thank you and hung up. Carolyn called me that evening around 7. She was crying, not the performed kind, the kind that comes out broken and uneven when someone has been holding it in for hours and finally can't anymore. She said she hadn't known how far it had gone. Said Philip told her the arrangement with the house was legal, that he'd worked it out with a financial advisor, that it was a short-term bridge to cover some debts and they'd have it resolved within a year. Said she didn't know about the forged signature, didn't know about Apex. I listened to all of it. When she finished, I didn't say much. I told her I heard her. I told her we'd talk when things settled. Then I said good night and I hung up. Here's what I know for certain. Carolyn did not forge my signature. Carolyn did not set up the LLC. Carolyn did not contact Apex Lending Group. Those things are on Philip. Here's what I also know. She watched me on the floor of that hallway and she walked away. Whatever she knew or didn't know before that moment, she made a decision in that moment. And that decision is also hers. I'm not interested in pretending otherwise, but I'm also not interested in making her into something simpler than she is. She's my daughter. She's 34 years old, and she married the wrong man, and she made bad choices trying to keep that marriage together. That's a real thing that happens to real people. It doesn't excuse what she did. It just means she's a person and not a character in a story. The prosecutor's office moved quickly once they had the package. The Elder Financial Abuse Statute in Ohio is a felony charge. Forging a signature on a property deed is a separate felony. The reverse mortgage fraud added a third count. Philip was looking at significant exposure, and he knew it. His attorney called Leonard within 48 hours to discuss cooperation. Carolyn was interviewed by the prosecutor's office the following week. She had information about Philip's financial activity going back 2 years. The timeline of his debts, the conversations about the house, his contacts at Apex, the sequence of decisions that led to the LLC formation. She gave them all of it. In exchange, she was not charged as a co-conspirator. The prosecutor determined her involvement didn't meet the threshold for criminal liability. I was told this by Leonard in a matter-of-fact phone call. I said I understood. The civil side moved on a parallel track. Leonard connected me with a real estate attorney who specialized in deed fraud recovery. She filed to have the quitclaim deed voided on the basis of forgery. She also filed to have the reverse mortgage nullified, naming Apex Lending Group as a party. Once Apex received the subpoena and saw the full picture of what Philip had done, they cooperated immediately. They had no interest in being attached to an elder fraud prosecution. They folded fast. The deed was voided by court order about 6 weeks after Philip's arrest. The reverse mortgage was nullified 2 weeks after that. Every instrument Philip had used to peel my house away from me was unwound one by one until my name was the only name on the property again. The attorney mailed me the corrected deed on a Friday. I got it out of the mailbox in the afternoon and stood on the front porch and looked at it for a moment before going inside. It was just paper. Same house it had always been, but holding it felt like something. Philip pled guilty to 2 counts of elder financial abuse and 1 count of document forgery. The sentencing guidelines put him at 4 to 7 years. His attorney negotiated based on the cooperation he'd provided about Apex's broader lending practices, which apparently was useful to a separate investigation. Even with that, he was looking at real time. I wasn't in the courtroom for the plea. Leonard offered to go with me if I wanted to be there. I thought about it and decided I didn't need to see it. I already knew how it ended. Sitting in a courtroom wasn't going to add anything to that. What I thought about more, in the weeks after everything was resolved, was the earlier part, the good months. Oliver in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, the two of us just sitting there in the quiet, Carolyn making pot roast on Sundays. The feeling, which I now understand was not entirely real, but was also not entirely false, that the house had people in it again. I missed that, not Philip. But the version of things where it had been true. Leonard came by on a Saturday afternoon about a month after the sentencing. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and he asked me how I was holding up. I told him I was fine, meant it mostly. He asked about Carolyn. I told him she'd been sending short texts, checking in. I'd been reading them and not responding. He nodded like that was a complete answer, which it was. Before he left, he stood at the front door and said I'd handled it well. Said a lot of men in my position would have blown the whole thing up the night they found that document and lost everything they had in the courts. I told him 25 years in the business teaches you that patience is the only thing that actually works. He said he supposed that was right. Then he left, and the house went quiet again. I didn't respond to Carolyn's texts for about 6 weeks. Not because I was punishing her. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't sitting at the kitchen table composing responses in my head and deciding not to send them. I genuinely didn't know what to say, and I've never been the kind of man who talks just to fill the silence. What I kept coming back to wasn't the house. The house was resolved. The deed was mine again. The mortgage was nullified. Philip was going to spend the next several years dealing with the consequences of his own decisions. That chapter was closed in the way that legal processes close things, which is to say completely on paper and not particularly cleanly in your chest. What I kept coming back to was that hallway. I've replayed it probably 200 times. The way she looked at me on the floor, the way her face moved through whatever it moved through in those 3 seconds, and then the turn, the walk back to the kitchen, the door closing. I'm not a man who cries easily. I didn't cry that night, but I'll tell you, that image has more weight in me than anything else that happened across this whole thing. More than finding the document, more than the shove, more than sitting in the ER at 10 at night with a fractured wrist. She's my daughter. That's not something that goes away, but something changed its shape, and I'm still figuring out what the new shape is. I texted her back on a Thursday morning in early fall, kept it short, said I was doing well, and that I hoped Oliver was good. She responded within 2 minutes, said he was crawling now and getting into everything, said she was sorry, said she didn't expect me to respond to that right away. I didn't, but I've kept the line open. That's the most I can say right now. There's no version of this where I tell her it's fine, because it isn't. There's also no version where I decide she's entirely what Philip was, because she isn't that either. She's somewhere in between, in that complicated territory where most real situations actually live. I think about Oliver more than I expected to. He's going to grow up in a smaller apartment with one parent working to keep things together and a father he won't see for years. That's not nothing. Kids carry the weight of what their parents do, whether anyone tells them about it or not. I hope he comes out of it with his own sense of who he wants to be. That's the best I can hope for from where I'm standing. The house is quiet now, the kind of quiet that has some peace in it rather than just absence. I put Nadine's reading chair back in the corner of the living room about a month after everything was resolved. I'm not sure exactly why I moved it back. It just felt right. Some things belong where they belong. I go to see her every Sunday, same as always. I sit with her and tell her about the week. I told her about all of this piece by piece as it was happening. Told her I was sorry our daughter got tangled up in it. Told her I thought she would have handled Carolyn better than I'm handling it now, because Nadine always knew how to stay in relationship with people even when they disappointed her. That was a skill I never fully learned. I'm working on it. Last week I went to the diner down the street, same corner table I've been sitting at for 20 years. The waitress knows my order, brought my coffee before I asked. I sat there for an hour with a newspaper, and it was a perfectly ordinary morning, and I was glad for it. At 67, ordinary mornings are not nothing. They are actually quite a lot. I want to say something directly to anyone watching this who is in a situation that feels like it has no good move. Maybe someone in your life has been taking from you slowly, piece by piece, in ways that are hard to name. Maybe you've been telling yourself it's family, so you let it go. Maybe you've been waiting for them to come around, to see what they're doing, to stop on their own. I understand that. I did the same thing for longer than I should have. But here's what I learned from 25 years of this work, and from everything that happened in my own house. Patience is not the same as passivity. Waiting is not the same as accepting. You can be completely calm, completely quiet, and still be building a case. You can love someone and still hold them accountable. Those things are not opposites. Document everything. Talk to an attorney. Call someone you trust, who knows more than you do about whatever corner you're backed into, and do not react until you know the full picture. The quietest response is almost always the most effective one. I've got my house. I've got my name on my deed. I've got Sunday mornings at the cemetery and Thursday mornings at the diner, and a reading chair in the corner of the living room that belongs exactly where it is. That is enough. More than enough. It took me a while to see it that way, but I do now.